The strangest promise I ever heard came from the only man who could have anything he wanted. The wind coming off the river cut through my thrift store coat, like it had a personal grudge against me. December in Boston Harbor never cared whether you had a warm apartment waiting or an abandoned ferry terminal to hide inside. I pulled my backpack closer against my chest and checked the worn bus ticket tucked inside my wallet for what had to be the 100th time that week. It had belonged to my mother. The ink had faded years ago, but I still carried it everywhere because it reminded me that home had once been a real place instead of a memory. Most people walk past the old terminal without looking twice. To them, it was another forgotten building waiting for demolition. To me, it was shelter from freezing rain, and another night I didn't have to spend wondering whether someone would steal the few things I still owned. I had learned that survival wasn't about luck. It was about becoming invisible. Invisible people got ignored. Invisible people stayed alive. I was halfway through eating the peanut butter sandwich a volunteer had slipped into my backpack that afternoon when I heard footsteps echo across the empty dock. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Instinct tightened every muscle in my body. I reached for my backpack and backed deeper into the shadows. Rich people didn't come here. Neither did tourists. Anyone walking these docks after midnight was either completely lost or carrying problems they didn't want anyone else to see. Then I saw him. Tall, broad shoulders, dark wool coat soaked by freezing rain. His polished shoes splashed through shallow puddles without hesitation, as though he had somewhere important to be even while the rest of the city slept. Under the flickering security light, he looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine instead of wandering an abandoned pier alone. He took another step before suddenly grabbing the rusted railing beside him. His breathing became uneven. For one strange second, our eyes met across the empty platform. His weren't angry. They weren't frightened either. They looked tired, not the kind of tired cured by sleep, the kind carried for years until it became part of who you were. Then he slowly sank on a one knee. Every survival instinct screamed at me to leave. People with expensive watches and tailored coats always came with expensive problems. I had spent 2 years learning that kindness often carried a price tag bigger than I could ever afford. I turned toward the exit. I actually made it 3 steps before stopping. My mother's voice drifted back from somewhere deep inside my memory. If someone is reaching the end of their strength, don't measure what they own. Measure what they need. I closed my eyes for one long breath before walking back toward the stranger. Up close, I noticed tiny details no one else probably would have cared about. His hands were shaking despite the cold. Raindrops clung to silver strands near his temples. An old wristwatch rested beneath his sleeve, its cracked glass frozen at exactly 9:17, as though time itself had refused to move forward. "Sir," I whispered carefully, "can you hear me?" He opened his eyes just enough to look at me. His voice barely rose above the wind. "You should leave." I almost laughed. "Funny," I said quietly. "I was about to tell you the same thing." He tried to push himself back to his feet, but the movement ended almost as soon as it began. His hand slipped from the cold railing, and I caught his arm before he could lose his balance completely. Even through the thick fabric of his coat, I could feel how tense every muscle in his body had become. He looked at me with quiet frustration, as though accepting help offended something deep inside him. "I am fine," he said, each word measured carefully. I glanced around the deserted ferry terminal and smiled despite the freezing wind. People who are fine usually do not end up sitting on frozen concrete after midnight. For the first time, the corner of his mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile, more like someone remembering what smiling used to feel like. "You should not stay here," he replied softly. "Neither should you." The silence between us settled with the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the rusted roof overhead. Harbor lights shimmered across the black. Water stretching into long ribbons that disappeared every time another wave rolled in. I tightened the scarf around my neck and reached into my backpack. The sandwich I had saved for breakfast suddenly felt less important than the stranger sitting beside me. I held it toward him. "It is only peanut butter," I said. "Do not expect a 5-star meal." He stared at it for several seconds before accepting it with surprising hesitation. "You are giving away your dinner. Tomorrow is another day." That is an optimistic way to look at life. I shrugged. Optimism is cheaper than therapy. A quiet laugh escaped him before he seemed almost embarrassed by it. The sound disappeared into the cold night as quickly as it had arrived. He took one careful bite, then stopped. I noticed his attention drifting toward the old bus ticket peeking from my wallet. "Someone important?" he asked. My fingers instinctively covered the faded paper. "My mother." He nodded once without asking another question, and somehow that simple respect made me trust him a little more. Most people wanted the whole story. They wanted tragedy packaged into something they could pity for 5 minutes before walking away. He simply accepted that some memories belonged to the person carrying them. The wind grew stronger. I pointed toward the abandoned storage room where I usually slept. There's less wind inside. He looked toward the building before slowly standing with my help. His expensive shoes left dark footprints across the cracked concrete floor, while my worn sneakers squeaked with every step. The contrast almost made me laugh. We entered the empty room where an old emergency lantern still worked if someone shook it hard enough. After 3 determined tries, warm yellow light filled the small space. It revealed peeling paint, broken windows covered with plywood, and the pile of blankets I had collected over the past winter. Without thinking, I spread the thickest blanket across an old wooden bench. "Take it," I said. "You need it more." He looked at the blanket, then back at me. "Where will you sleep?" "I have another one." It was a lie, and judging by the expression in his pale gray eyes, he knew it immediately. Instead of arguing, he quietly removed his coat and draped it over my shoulders. The wool still carried the faint scent of cedar and cold winter air. It was warmer than anything I had worn in months. Before I could protest, headlights swept across the broken windows outside. Several black vehicles rolled silently into the abandoned parking lot. The stranger closed his eyes for one brief moment, almost like a man who had hoped they would never find him, and whispered, "They came sooner than I expected." The engines outside went quiet one after another until the only sound left was the rain dripping from the roof. I stood frozen beside the broken lantern while bright headlights painted long shadows across the cracked floor. Whoever had arrived was not lost. They had come here with purpose. The man beside me slowly opened his eyes and exhaled as if he had spent the last few minutes hoping the world would simply forget he existed. "You should leave through the back," he said. "There is still time." I folded my arms across my chest, his heavy coat wrapped tightly around me. "You keep saying that, but you still have not told me why." Before he could answer, footsteps echoed outside. They were calm, organized, almost respectful. A moment later, the storage room door opened. 4 men stepped inside wearing dark winter coats instead of expensive suits, but everything about them spoke of discipline. None of them raised their voices. None of them rushed forward. They simply looked relieved to find the stranger standing safely before them. The oldest among them, a man with silver hair and kind eyes that looked strangely out of place on such a serious face, lowered his head slightly. "Mr. Whitlock," he said quietly, "we have been searching for hours." I looked from him to the man beside me. Whitlock. The name sounded familiar, but exhaustion kept my mind from placing it. Graham gave a small nod. I needed a little silence. The older man noticed the coat around my shoulders and then the untouched half of the peanut butter sandwich resting on the bench. His expression softened for just a second before returning to careful professionalism. "The board meeting begins in less than 2 hours, he reminded Graham gently. "Everyone is waiting." Graham answered with a tired smile that never reached his eyes. "They can wait another 5 minutes." Nobody argued with him. That silence told me more than words ever could. Whoever Graham Whitlock was, these people answered to him without question. One of the younger men approached carrying a neatly folded blanket and a medical bag. He paused before opening it, looking to Graham for permission first. Graham nodded once. The man quietly checked his pulse and breathing, asking only simple questions in a calm voice. There was no panic, no dramatic ruse. Just quiet concern from people who clearly cared whether he was well enough to stand. I watched the scene unfold, trying to understand why someone important enough to travel with a convoy had been wandering an abandoned ferry terminal alone. My thoughts stopped when the older man turned toward me. "Miss, thank you for staying with him tonight." I shrugged awkwardly. Anyone would have done the same. For pairs of eyes met mine at once. The silence that followed made it clear they did not believe that. Graham looked down at the cracked watch on his wrist before speaking again. "She is right," he said softly. "The world simply forgets how often ordinary kindness changes everything." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, paused for a long moment, then slowly pulled his hand back out empty. "I almost made a mistake," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The older man frowned with quiet concern. "Sir," Graham ignored the question. Instead, he turned to me. "What is your name?" "Evelyn Harper." He repeated it once under his breath, as though committing it to memory forever. "Evelyn," he said, "I would like to repay your kindness." I laughed lightly. "You already did. You gave me your coat." His eyes held mine with an expression I could not explain. It was not gratitude alone. It was recognition, almost as if he had just found the answer to a question he had been carrying for years. Then, without another word, he stepped into one of the waiting vehicles and disappeared into the rainy night, leaving me convinced I would never see Graham Whitlock again. The next morning arrived, wrapped in gray skies and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the church shelter 2 blocks away. I returned Graham's coat to the volunteer desk, convinced someone from his company would eventually come looking for it. They never did. 3 quiet days passed, each one blending into the next with the familiar rhythm of community breakfasts, job applications that went unanswered, and afternoons spent helping Miriam Ellis sort donated clothes for families who had even less than I did. Life had a strange way of pretending extraordinary moments had never happened. I almost believed that night at the ferry terminal had been nothing more than a dream. Then, just after noon on the 4th day, every conversation inside the shelter stopped. Through the front window, I saw a line of black vehicles parked neatly along the curb. Nobody rushed. Nobody spoke loudly. Men and women stepped out wearing simple winter coats instead of flashy business suits, but they carried themselves with quiet confidence that made the entire room pause. Miriam looked toward me with confused eyes. "Evelyn," she whispered, "I think they are here for you." I laughed because there was no other reasonable response. Nobody had ever come looking for me before. I stepped outside into the cold December air, expecting some kind of misunderstanding. The same silver-haired gentleman from the ferry terminal approached with a polite smile. "Miss Harper," he said, "Mr. Whitlock would like a few minutes of your time." I crossed my arms. Did he forget his sandwich? The man actually smiled. "No, Miss Harper. He has not forgotten anything." Before I could ask another question, the rear door of the middle vehicle opened. Graham stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat and a navy scarf. He looked completely different from the exhausted stranger I had met only days earlier. His posture was straight, his hair neatly combed, and people instinctively made room for him without being asked. Yet the old cracked watch still rested on his wrist, unchanged, as though it belonged to a different life he refused to leave behind. He walked toward me without security, surrounding him. "How is the shelter?" he asked. I blinked in surprise. "You remember where I live? I remember everything that matters." His answer landed more heavily than he probably intended. I cleared my throat. "Your coat is inside. Keep it. I cannot accept something that expensive." "Then think of it as repayment for the blanket you insisted I use." I shook my head. "That still leaves us even." A faint smile appeared again. "I was hoping you would say that." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a plain white envelope. No company logo, no gold lettering, just my name written neatly across the front in blue ink. He handed it to me with both hands, almost respectfully. Curious, I opened it immediately. Inside was a marriage license application with most of the paperwork already completed. My heart skipped, so suddenly I wondered whether I had read it correctly. I looked back at Graham, convinced this had to be some elaborate misunderstanding. "You cannot possibly be serious." His expression never changed. I have never been more serious in my life. The city traffic continued moving behind us. A child laughed somewhere across the street. Everything around us carried on as though the world had not just shifted beneath my feet. Then Graham quietly said the sentence that would change both of our lives forever. "Evelyn Harper, will you marry me?" For several long seconds, I simply stared at the paper in my hands, convinced the freezing air had finally made me lose my mind. Then I looked back at Graham, waiting for the smile that would reveal this was some strange joke. It never came. His calm expression remained unchanged, patient enough to let me reach my own conclusion. I folded the application and handed it back to him. "You do not even know me." He accepted the envelope without looking away. "I know enough." "No, you know that I shared a sandwich and a blanket with a stranger. Sometimes that tells you more about a person than years of conversation." I shook my head, almost laughing from disbelief. "People do not ask homeless women to marry them." "Most people do not," he answered quietly. "I'm not most people." That much was obvious. I looked toward the line of waiting vehicles and then back at the shelter behind me, where Miriam was pretending not to watch through the front window. Everything in my life had taught me to distrust opportunities that appeared too perfect. Every promise had eventually come with hidden conditions. "What do you actually want from me?" I asked. Graham did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the street where an elderly man struggled to carry 2 heavy grocery bags through the snow. Without saying a word, Graham walked over, lifted the bags with effortless courtesy, and carried them all the way to the man's apartment entrance before quietly returning. He never introduced himself, never waited for thanks. When he came back, he simply said, "I need someone who still chooses kindness when nobody is watching." His answer unsettled me more than any speech could have. That cannot be the whole reason. It is the beginning of it. The silver-haired gentleman, whom I still did not know by name, remained several yards away, deliberately giving us privacy. No one interrupted. No one pressured me. Graham reached into his coat pocket again and removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue keychain shaped like a lighthouse. "This belongs to an apartment downtown," he said. "It is yours whether you marry me or not." I frowned. "Why?" "Because everyone deserves a front door that locks." I pushed the key back toward him. "I cannot accept charity." His eyes softened with something that looked almost familiar. "Neither could I once." The sentence lingered between us longer than the winter wind. For the first time, I noticed how tired he still looked beneath the polished appearance. The expensive coat and clean haircut could not hide the quiet exhaustion in his face. It was the same look I had seen at the ferry terminal, the expression of someone carrying a burden too heavy to describe. "What happened to you?" I asked before I could stop myself. He glanced at the cracked watch frozen at 9:17. His thumb brushed gently across the broken glass. "One day," he said softly, "I forgot what mattered most." Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated once. He read the message, and the warmth disappeared from his expression almost instantly. Not anger, not fear, resignation. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at me with steady eyes. "I'm asking you to trust someone the world has every reason to distrust." I crossed my arms tightly against the cold. "Then give me one reason to say yes." Graham held my gaze for a long, silent moment before answering with a sentence that made my heartbeat stumble. "Because if you do, you might help me save the only thing I have left worth saving." His words followed me long after the convoy disappeared around the corner. That night, I barely slept. The church shelter felt smaller than ever, every creak of the old building mixing with a question I could not answer. Why would a man with unlimited resources ask someone who owned nothing to stand beside him? By sunrise, I still had no explanation, only the memory of his tired eyes and the strange certainty that he had not lied to me once. Miriam found me sitting on the back steps with a paper cup of coffee warming my hands. She lowered herself onto the step beside me without saying anything for nearly a minute. "People only ask impossible questions when ordinary answers have failed," she finally said. I smiled faintly. "Would you marry a man you met 4 days ago?" She chuckled softly. "No, but I would ask why he chose me before saying no." Her words stayed with me all morning. Around noon, I borrowed the shelter computer and searched the name Graham Whitlock. Hundreds of articles appeared. Business magazines called him a brilliant logistics executive who had rebuilt struggling shipping companies across New England. Charity newsletters praised anonymous donations that had restored community centers and funded shelters. Then there were other headlines. Rumors, speculation, stories connecting his name to powerful people who never appeared in photographs twice. None of the articles actually proved anything, yet they all painted the same picture. Graham Whitlock was a man surrounded by questions nobody seemed able to answer. I closed the browser, more confused than before. Late that afternoon, my borrowed phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Miss Harper, the familiar silver-haired voice said gently. My name is Calvin Mercer. Mr. Whitlock asked me to invite you somewhere. No pressure, no expectations, simply lunch. I nearly refused out of habit. Then curiosity won. An hour later, I found myself standing outside a quiet neighborhood restaurant overlooking the harbor. It was not flashy. Families filled most of the tables. Construction workers laughed over sandwiches, while an elderly couple shared soup near the window. Graham stood when I walked in, wearing a simple navy sweater instead of an expensive suit. Somehow he looked more comfortable here than he ever had surrounded by black vehicles. Thank you for coming, he said. I almost did not. I know. He pulled out a chair, then sat only after I did. There were no security guards inside. No dramatic display of wealth. The waitress greeted him by his first name and asked whether he wanted his usual turkey sandwich and tomato soup. He smiled politely and thanked her. That ordinary exchange surprised me more than anything else. This is your favorite place? I asked. It was my mother's. His answer carried the same quiet weight I felt every time I touched my old bus ticket. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. Favorite books, winter storms, the best apple pie in the city. He never mentioned marriage, never tried to persuade me. Then, as our plates were cleared away, he placed a thin manila folder on the table between us. I'm not asking for your answer today, he said softly. I am asking you to understand why I asked the question. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were photographs of community housing projects, scholarship letters, donation records, and handwritten notes from families whose lives had quietly changed. Beneath them rested another document sealed inside a clear envelope marked only with today's date. Graham rested one hand lightly on the folder. Do not read that one yet, he said. When the time is right, it will explain everything. I looked up at him, searching for the hidden motive I had expected to find. Instead, I saw the same exhausted man from the abandoned ferry terminal, carrying a burden that seemed heavier every time we met. I carried the unopened folder with me for 2 days before I finally admitted it had become heavier than the backpack on my shoulders. It was not the weight of paper. It was the weight of wondering why a man with every advantage in the world seemed desperate for someone who had spent the last 2 years trying not to be noticed. I still refused to open the sealed envelope inside. Graham had asked me to wait, and for reasons I could not explain, I trusted that request. Instead, I read every thank you letter tucked into the folder. A retired teacher thanking an anonymous donor for saving her neighborhood library. A father describing how affordable housing had kept his family together after losing his job. A handwritten card from a little girl who drew a crooked lighthouse with bright yellow crayons because someone had paid for her mother's cancer treatments. None of the letters mentioned Graham Whitlock by name, yet I knew exactly who had stood quietly behind every miracle. That afternoon, I found myself walking toward the harbor restaurant without calling ahead. I told myself I was only returning the folder. Deep down, I knew I wanted answers. The waitress smiled the moment she saw me. He is in the back, she said as though she had expected me. Graham sat alone near the window with a notebook open beside a cup of black tea that had already gone cold. He looked up as I approached and closed the notebook immediately. You came back, he said. I told myself I was returning your paperwork. And what are you actually here for? I slid into the chair across from him and placed the folder gently on the table. I want to understand why every article about you feels incomplete. A quiet smile touched his face. Because they only write about the man they can see, then tell me about the one they cannot. He looked through the rain-speckled window for several long seconds before answering. Do you know why I still wear a broken watch? I shook my head. His fingers rested lightly on the cracked glass frozen at 9:17. Because that was the minute I lost someone I should have. Protected. His voice remained calm, but something inside those few words carried years of regret. I wanted to ask more, yet something told me he was offering only the piece he was ready to share. Before either of us spoke again, Calvin Mercer entered the restaurant with unusual urgency. He leaned down beside Graham and quietly handed him a folded note instead of speaking aloud. Graham read it once. The warmth disappeared from his face, replaced by the same quiet resignation I had seen outside the ferry terminal. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. I have to leave, he said. Business? I asked. He hesitated before nodding. Something that should have ended a long time ago. He stood, then paused beside the table instead of walking away. Evelyn, there is one favor I need from you. What is it? If anyone asks whether you have seen me today, tell them you have not. I stared at him in confusion. Why? He gave the smallest shake of his head. Because the fewer people who know where you are, the safer you will be. Before I could respond, he walked out into the rain with Calvin beside him. I watched through the window until the black sedan disappeared into traffic. Only then did I notice the notebook he had accidentally left behind on the table. I reached for it, intending to return it later, but when it slipped open in my hands, I caught a glimpse of a page filled with names, dates, and one handwritten sentence at the very top that made my heart stop for a moment. It read, "Everything ends when the truth reaches the right hands." My fingers tightened around the notebook as though it might disappear if I looked away for even a second. I knew I should close it immediately. I knew it was not mine, but one page had already slipped open, and curiosity has a quiet voice that is often louder than common sense. The names were organized into careful columns. Dates stretched back almost 10 years. Beside each name sat handwritten notes, short and precise, followed by a single word written in blue ink. Cleared, protected, relocated, closed. None of it looked like the records of a businessman. It looked like someone slowly untangling a knot that had taken years to tighten. Then I noticed another page folded neatly inside the notebook. Before I could read more than the first line, the waitress hurried back to my table. "He forgot that again?" she asked with a gentle smile. "Again." She nodded while collecting empty coffee cups from the neighboring table. "Mr. Whitlock always leaves something behind whenever he has too much on his mind. Last month, it was his glasses. Before that, an umbrella." She laughed quietly. "He never forgets people, only objects." I closed the notebook immediately. Somehow that simple sentence revealed more about Graham than another 100 newspaper articles ever could. I carried the notebook outside, expecting to see one of the black vehicles waiting nearby, but the street was empty except for passing traffic and melting snow along the sidewalks. I slipped the notebook carefully into my backpack, planning to return it the next morning. Halfway back to the shelter, I noticed something unusual. The same dark blue pickup truck rolled past me twice within 3 blocks. Maybe it was coincidence. Cities were full of familiar vehicles. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. I changed direction, cutting through the small public library where warm lights spilled onto the sidewalk. 10 minutes later, the truck slowly passed again. My heartbeat quickened. I remembered Graham's last words. "The fewer people who know where you are, the safer you will be." By the time I reached the shelter, dusk had settled over the neighborhood. Miriam looked up the moment I stepped inside. "Everything all right?" she asked. I forced a smile that fooled neither of us. "I think someone followed me." Her expression grew serious, but she did not panic. Instead, she quietly locked the front door before leading me into her small office. "Tell me exactly what happened." I described the truck, the repeated turns, the strange feeling that someone had been watching from a distance without ever approaching. Miriam listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached in her desk drawer and handed me an old flip phone. "This belonged to my husband," she said. "The battery still lasts for days. Program. Only one number." A small card rested beneath it. "Graham Whitlock." I looked at her in surprise. "You already had his number?" She smiled sadly. He helped keep this shelter open 5 winters ago. He asked for one promise in return. What promise? If I ever believed someone here was in real danger, I was supposed to call him first. Before I could ask another question, the old phone vibrated in my hand. There was only one message on the screen. No greeting. No signature. Just 8 words that instantly made the room feel colder than the December wind outside. Do not return the notebook. Someone else is looking for it. The message stayed on the tiny screen long after it should have disappeared. I read it again and again, hoping the words would somehow change. They never did. Someone else was looking for the notebook. I slowly lifted my eyes toward Miriam. She did not ask what the message said. She only looked at my face and quietly replied, "You should call him." My thumb hovered over Graham's number for several seconds before I finally pressed it. The line rang only once. "Are you safe?" His voice came immediately, calm, but carrying an urgency I had never heard before. "I think so. Where are you?" "At the shelter." I heard him exhale softly. "Stay there. Do not leave until I arrive." The call ended before I could ask a single question. Less than 30 minutes later, headlights swept across the church parking lot. There was no convoy this time, only one dark sedan. Graham stepped out alone, wearing the same navy overcoat from our lunch. Snowflakes settled quietly on his shoulders as he walked toward the entrance. He looked exhausted, yet strangely relieved to see me standing there. Miriam greeted him with a warm nod before quietly excusing herself, giving us the small office to ourselves. Graham closed the door gently behind him. His eyes immediately found the notebook resting on the desk. "Thank you for keeping it safe," he said. I folded my arms. "You said someone else wants it." He nodded once. "They do." "Who?" He remained silent for several moments, studying the cracked watch frozen forever at 9:17. Finally, he looked back at me with an honesty that felt almost painful. People who believe the past should never be uncovered. I pushed the notebook toward him, but kept one hand resting on the cover. "No more half answers, Graham." He did not argue. Instead, he slowly pulled a chair beside mine and sat down. "You asked me why I chose you," he began quietly. "The truth is, I did not choose you because you were homeless. I chose you because when you believed I had nothing left to offer, you still shared the only meal you had." His words settled into the silence between us. "Years ago," he continued, "I built my life around success, influence, and winning every negotiation. I convinced myself that protecting people meant controlling everything around them. Then one decision cost someone I loved everything." His fingers rested lightly against the broken watch. "Since that day, every choice I have made has been about repairing what can still be repaired." I listened without interrupting. For the first time since we met, the polished businessman disappeared completely. Sitting beside me was simply a tired man carrying years of regret. "The notebook," I asked softly, "what is it really?" He looked directly into my eyes. "It is a record of every family we quietly helped after mistakes that should never have happened. Every home rebuilt. Every scholarship funded. Every life we could still reach before it was too late." I blinked in surprise. "Then why would anyone want it?" Graham smiled sadly. "Because hidden inside those pages is a map leading to something much bigger." Before I could ask what he meant, he reached into his coat and carefully removed the sealed envelope from the folder he had given me days earlier. He placed it gently in front of me. "It is time," he whispered. "Open this now." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The first sentence stole the breath from my lungs. "If you are reading this, it means I finally found someone I trust more than I trust myself." My eyes stayed fixed on the first sentence until the words began to blur. I took a slow breath and continued reading while the room around me seemed to disappear. The letter was written in Graham's careful handwriting, every line steady, every sentence weighed before it reached the page. He admitted that for years he had believed influence alone could protect the people around him. Every compromise had seemed temporary. Every difficult decision had promised a better tomorrow. But somewhere along the way, he realized that every shortcut carried a cost paid by someone else. He wrote that the cracked watch on his wrist had not stopped because it was broken. He had stopped winding it on purpose after the moment his younger brother died, following a chain of choices Graham believed he should have prevented. Since then, he had measured every day not by success, but by whether he had repaired even a small piece of the damage left behind. My hands trembled as I lowered the letter. Graham remained completely silent, allowing the truth to settle without interruption. Finally, I looked up. "You have been preparing this for years." He nodded once. "Longer than anyone realizes. Everything in the notebook, every family, every scholarship, every apartment. They were never charity," he answered quietly. "They were promises I could still keep." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. "Then why ask me to marry you?" For the first time since we met, uncertainty crossed his face. It was so unexpected that it made him seem less like the powerful man described in newspapers and more like someone afraid of hearing the wrong answer. "Because people trust appearances," he said. "If I simply transferred everything I built, the questions would begin immediately. If I disappeared, everything could fall into the wrong hands. But if there is someone the law recognizes as my family, the transition becomes possible." I stared at him, letting every word settle into place. "So, this is about protecting your work." "Partly." His answer came almost as a whisper. "And the other part?" He smiled with quiet sadness. "The other part is entirely selfish." I waited. "The night you shared your blanket with a stranger, you reminded me that kindness still existed without expecting applause, headlines, or repayment." I realized I'd spent years surrounded by people who admired power but had forgotten how to recognize goodness. Then I met you. The office fell silent except for the old radiator humming against the winter cold. I reached into my wallet and touched my mother's faded bus ticket. She used to tell me that the right people rarely entered your life at the right time. They arrived when you needed courage more than certainty. "I cannot promise that I understand all of this," I admitted. "I would worry if you did." A faint laugh escaped both of us before disappearing into the quiet room. Graham slowly stood and walked toward the window. Snow drifted gently across the church parking lot where his lone sedan waited beneath the streetlight. "There is one more truth I have not told you," he said without turning around. "Everything I've shown you so far was only preparation." I felt my heartbeat quicken. Preparation for what? He faced me again, his expression calmer than I had ever seen it. "For the day I ask you to do something that will make you question everything you believe about me." The room remained silent long after Graham's words faded into the soft hum of the old radiator. Outside, fresh snow settled over the church parking lot, covering every tire track as though the world itself wanted to erase the paths that had brought us here. I stood beside the desk, holding his letter against my chest, searching his face for some sign that he had changed his mind. Instead, I found something I had never seen in him before. Peace. Not happiness. Not relief. The quiet peace of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. "What are you preparing me for?" I asked again. Graham walked back toward the desk and carefully placed the cracked watch beside the notebook. Without it on his wrist, he somehow looked lighter and older at the same time. "There comes a moment," he said softly, "when repairing the future requires telling the whole truth about the past." I looked at the watch frozen forever at 9:17. "You are talking as though you already know how this ends." He gave a faint smile. "I know how I hope it ends. The rest is no longer my decision." He reached into his coat and removed a thick envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Unlike the first letter, this one carried no handwriting on the front, only my name. He rested it beside the notebook, but did not let go immediately. "Inside are documents that explain everything I have hidden for years," he said. "Financial records, personal statements, names, every decision I wish I could undo, and every promise I've tried to keep." I stared at the envelope without touching it. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because if I keep carrying it alone, it dies with me." His answer landed with frightening simplicity. My throat tightened. "You keep talking as though something terrible is about to happen." Graham slowly shook his head. "No, something honest is about to happen." The office door opened quietly, and Calvin Mercer stepped inside. He did not interrupt immediately. Instead, He waited respectfully until Graham looked toward him. "Sir," Calvin said in a calm voice, "everyone has arrived." Graham nodded once, as though he had expected those words all along. Calvin glanced briefly at me before leaving the room again, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Graham picked up the cracked watch one last time and fastened it around his wrist. "There is a meeting tonight," he explained. "By tomorrow morning, everything will be different." I felt my heartbeat growing louder. Different how? He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the exhaustion still hidden beneath his steady expression. "Evelyn, if you choose to walk away after tonight, I will understand. You owe me nothing. Not your trust. Not your future. Not your name." I looked at the faded bus ticket still tucked inside my wallet. For years it had reminded me of where I came from. Now, standing in that small office, I realized it was also reminding me who I wanted to become. I met his eyes without looking away. "I'm still here." Something warm crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. He placed the sealed envelope into my hands, closed my fingers around it, and whispered the sentence that made every piece of the puzzle suddenly point toward a future I had never imagined. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to ask you to call the authorities, and when they arrive, I want you to be the one who places me under arrest." That night, I never closed my eyes. The sealed envelope rested on the small wooden table beside my bed while the old flip phone lay silently next to it. Outside, snow continued falling over the church roof, covering the city in a quiet white blanket that made everything feel suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. Just before sunrise, I finally opened the envelope Graham had placed in my hands. Inside were neatly organized documents, signed statements, financial records, and a personal letter addressed to the authorities. Every page carried the same message. He was no longer trying to protect himself. He was trying to protect everyone who would come after him. I sat there for nearly an hour, reading every word twice. Nothing in the file asked for sympathy. Nothing blamed anyone else. It was simply the truth, written by a man who had finally decided that honesty mattered more than reputation. My hands were still shaking when the old flip phone rang. "Good morning, Evelyn," Graham said calmly. His voice sounded lighter than it ever had before. "Did you read everything?" "Yes." Silence settled between us for a few seconds. Then I asked the only question that still mattered. "Are you certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything." I looked down on my mother's faded bus ticket resting beside the documents. She had always believed that courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing the right path while fear walked beside you. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Where are you?" He gave me an address overlooking the harbor. It was the same neighborhood where we had shared lunch only days before. "I will be waiting," he said gently. "Do not hurry. This decision belongs to you." The call ended. I stepped outside into the cold morning, carrying the envelope close against my coat. The city was only beginning to wake. Bakery windows glowed with warm light. Snowplows moved slowly through quiet streets. Parents held children's hands on their way to school. Life continued exactly as it always had, completely unaware that one man's decision would soon change countless others. When I reached the waterfront building, Graham was already standing outside alone. There were no black vehicles, no security, no audience, only the sound of waves touching the frozen docks where we had first met. He smiled when he saw me. "Thank you for coming." I walked toward him until only a few feet separated us. "You could still walk away," I whispered. He looked across the harbor before answering. "I spent years walking away from the truth. I'm tired of walking." I nodded slowly. My fingers tightened around the phone before I made the call. I spoke calmly, giving the address exactly as it appeared on the building entrance. When I finished, Graham quietly removed the cracked watch from his wrist and placed it in my hand. "Keep it," he said. "It reminded me every day of what I had lost. Maybe now it can remind both of us that time only truly moves forward when we stop hiding from it." Minutes later, several official vehicles arrived without sirens. The officers stepped out carefully, approaching with professional calm. Graham raised both hands slightly to show he intended to cooperate. Before anyone spoke, he looked directly at me one final time. "You once shared your last meal with a stranger," he said softly. Today you gave him something even greater, the chance to become an honest man. Tears blurred my vision as I handed the envelope to the lead investigator. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, reflecting across the harbor, and for the first time since I had met Graham Whitlock, neither of us was carrying the weight of a secret. 5 years passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. Winter still arrived with the same cold wind rolling across Boston Harbor, but my life no longer depended on finding a place to hide from it. The old church shelter still stood on the same corner, although it had grown into a larger community center with classrooms, affordable apartments, counseling offices, and a small library overlooking the water. Above the entrance hung a simple bronze plaque that read, "Every new beginning starts with one act of kindness." There was no name beneath it. Graham would have preferred it that way. Every morning, I unlocked the front door carrying the same faded bus ticket that had once belonged to my mother. It still lived inside my wallet, its edges softer now from years of being held whenever life demanded courage. Beside it rested another keepsake that never left my side. Graham's cracked watch, forever frozen at 9:17. I had never repaired it. Some moments were not meant to move forward. They were meant to remind us why we must. The records Graham entrusted to the authorities reshaped more lives than either of us could have imagined. Families found closure. Stolen resources returned to neighborhoods that had needed them for decades. Scholarships expanded. Community housing projects multiplied across the city. The shelter where we first met no longer struggled through every winter wondering whether donations would arrive in time. They always did, not because of one wealthy benefactor, but because hundreds of ordinary people decided kindness deserved another chance. On a bright October afternoon, I walked through the visitor entrance carrying a small paper bag from our favorite harbor restaurant. The same waitress still worked there. Every year, she packed one turkey sandwich and one slice of warm apple pie without asking why. She always smiled and wished me a good visit. Graham looked older when he entered the visiting room, his hair touched with more silver than before, yet something about him seemed lighter than the man I had met beneath the abandoned ferry terminal years earlier. The heavy exhaustion had disappeared from his eyes. In its place lived a quiet peace that could never have been purchased. He smiled when he saw the paper bag. "Turkey sandwich?" he asked. I laughed softly. "An apple pie." You remembered. I never forgot the ordinary things. We spent the afternoon talking about everything except the past. We spoke about the children, now living in safe apartments. The library adding another reading room. Miriam finally taking her first vacation in 20 years. Calvin Mercer retiring to a small coastal town where he volunteered at a food pantry every Thursday morning. Before the visit ended, Graham looked at the cracked watch resting beside my bus ticket on the table. "You kept it. You told me it would remind us that time moves forward when we stop hiding from the truth." He nodded thoughtfully. "Has it?" I looked through the window where autumn sunlight reflected across the harbor, almost exactly the way it had on the morning everything changed. "No," I answered with a smile. "People move forward. Time simply waits for us to catch up." The announcement, ending visiting hours, echoed gently through the building. Graham stood, but instead of saying goodbye, he rested one hand over his heart and gave me the same quiet smile he had worn the day he first thanked me for sharing half of a peanut butter sandwich with a stranger. Walking back toward the parking lot, I realized something my mother had tried to teach me all along. The strongest people are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones brave enough to tell the truth after they do, because sometimes the greatest act of love is not being rescued. Sometimes it is helping someone find the courage to become the person they still have time to be.